Hello everyone, my name is Michele Lancione and I am co-director with Abdulmalik Simon of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab, a lab based in Turin that looks at the politics of habitation in a number of urban contexts worldwide. And we have been running a seminar series for about 2 years. Every intervention in this series is recorded on our YouTube channel. You're going to find all the recordings and on our website as well, which is beyondinhabitation.org. Now, today I am really genuinely extremely happy to have Professor Mona Fawaz with us. I am happy for a number of reasons. First of all, because the work of Mona has been inspirational and influential, both for Malik and myself and the many people that are part of the lab. Also because we are inspired by the Beirut Urban Lab, and we think at the lab, at the Beirut Urban Lab, as a safe space to engage with and to learn from. So I just want to thank Mona and everyone else at the Beirut Urban Lab for the work that they have been doing. And then I'm excited also because Mona has been one of those proud voices, making important public statements around the current situation in Palestine. And not only that, Mona with the lab, the Beirut Urban Lab, have been able to produce important work, cartographic work, but also qualitative work, in order for us to understand the very important geographical consequences of the ethno-colonial project of the State of Israel in Palestine. So it's a way of doing a form of militant geography that I think it's extremely inspirational and relevant. So thank you, Mona, for that work. Now, I'm just going to introduce Mona very briefly, and then I will leave the floor to her. As I was saying, Mona Fawaz is Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at the American University of Beirut, where she co-founded the Beirut Urban Lab, a regional research center invested in working towards more inclusive, just, and viable cities. Mona is also honorary professor at the Department of Planning in the Ballet School at UCL, and she has taught in several European cities and held several international fellowships. Mona's research stems from the imperative of making cities more just, addressing urbanization through the lenses of informality and the low land housing property and space, always responding to the urge of informing planning theory and practice. Her findings are published in scholarly articles, book sections, and reports. She currently serves as a member of the editorial collective of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and she serves on the boards of the journal Planning Theory and City and Society. Now, today, Mona is going to offer us a talk titled Inhabiting Beirut's Cycles of Boom and Dust. She's going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. And that's about it from me. So, Mona, thank you again for being here today.
Thanks, Michele. Thank you so much for this generous introduction. I'm really happy to be with you today and to see so many friendly faces. Thank you, Chiara, for helping organize this. And of course, the invitation, Malik. Thank you to the Beyond Inhabitation Lab colleagues in Turin for making the time to be here, and others as well. I wanted to also recognize that I'm sort of presenting today about housing in Beirut at a time when almost everyone I know in Lebanon is overwhelmed by the scale of the monstrosities in the region. Those unfolding, of course, in Palestine, especially in Gaza, but also in South Lebanon. And just in recognition that one struggle doesn't stop another, I decided a few weeks ago that I should go back to also talking about housing, despite the fact that really a big part of our mental space is occupied by what is happening and by a sense of urgency that we are really helpless stopping a genocide. So I kind of wanted to start with that, and with this background, again, I will shift to Beirut and share my presentation and try to hope my computer doesn't crash. It didn't. Are you guys seeing my screen?
Yeah, we do. Thank you, Mona.
Okay, great. So I'll start with this picture from Beirut and start reading. So this large modern building that you're seeing here was originally intended to be a furnished apartment complex housing short-term business visitors and tourists coming in the Beirut of the 60s. Despite severe dilapidation, it is still possible to distinguish many of the architectural features of a building that was once part of the neighborhood's booming real estate activities. 60 years later, as you can see, things have changed. The building, which is locally known as Wizart al-Iqtisad because of its proximity to the Ministry of Economy, and Wizart al-Iqtisad is Ministry of Economy in Arabic, stands like a makeshift camp or tenement. At the time of the fieldwork in 2023, the building housed over 160 men, women, and children in 36 apartments distributed on the first 7 floors of the building. The remaining 6 were inaccessible, first because they're structurally damaged, and then because, obviously, without an elevator for 50 years, they're quite inaccessible. On the facade, balconies are without balustrades, and behind them, doors have lost their glass panes, allowing wind and rain to penetrate freely the apartments. Many residents have made makeshift curtains with swaths of nylon, cloth, or cardboard to provide some privacy. In addition, hanging laundry and stacking mattresses convey a feeling of an overcrowded living flowing out of the confined spaces. You can see those on the pictures. The decay, of course, extends well beyond the facade. Right from the entrance, one notices exposed electric wires and evident water leakages along the walls, doubled by the stink of old moisture. Mold grows uncontrollably on the ceiling and wall of most floor apartments and common hallways. Consequently, many residents, both adults and children, have told us they suffer from asthma or other respiratory diseases. These problems have been exacerbated by the recent ad hoc additions of bathrooms in the resubdivided housing units, and of course, without a proper location of services or shaft, it has affected the building terribly. So the building, Wizart al-Iqtisad, is located in Hamra. Hamra was the 1960s beating commercial and office center of Beirut, when Beirut received about 30% of the global trade of gold and was really a regional command and control center. Hamra is also the backyard of the American University of Beirut, where I work. Today, the neighborhood's fabric comes across as some form of incoherent patchwork, constantly remade and reinvented without the semblance of concerted planning or coordination or a vision or trajectory for where it may be heading. So a decade ago, city planners were still drawing plans for how a bright, unified future of Beirut may look. But the concerted effects of the overlapping crisis, so we have regional violence that I just talked about, but we have forced population displacement, whereby about a quarter of Beirut's residents now are refugees, mostly from Syria, the financial crisis, the meltdown that's been unfolding for 4 years, political disruption, geopolitical tensions, and then the so-called war on terrorism and its associated sanctions, and I can go on. But each of these crises has a juxtaposed flow of capital that's associated with it, and each pushes the city in a certain direction, making the city authorities really abandon any semblance of government. In any case, the country's been without a president for almost 2 years now, and we're counting. And at the local level, the municipal council, whose authority has been extended because there are no elections, only meets when there's a deal to pass. So that's Hamra. You're seeing the site of Hamra and the backyard, and those beautiful red tiles are AUB. The American University of Beirut, and that's more of the fabric that I'm describing. So what you see here is that a neighborhood fabric that eloquently reflects the circumstances I just described, a few remnants of Beirut's early urbanization, closely juxtaposed with empty parking lots, once the site of other houses, more likely demolished because of a threat of heritage classification. Buildings very much in the condition of Wizart al-Iqtisad that I just showed, that have contiguous borders with high-end developments, fenced, where multi-million, sometimes residential units are actually been built during the period of building boom, the recent one between 2004 and 2014. It is in some way what Danakov has called the convulsive city, a city in pieces where each part behaves in a relatively independent way. But what localized logics drive each of these pieces? And what are the mechanisms that structure their relations, particularly those that sustain the precarization of urban inhabitants, such as the ones I described in today's Beirut? So these are some of the pictures from Beirut that you can see, kind of pictures taken in the neighborhood. And we can get here to the now and what Beirut looks overall. So this interconnected relation between, sorry, let me just close this. The interconnected relation between the conflicting trajectories of Beirut's pieces is perhaps best demonstrated by the fact that we arrived to researching Wizart al-Iqtisad and numerous other buildings like this one when we set out to understand recent building developments, activities in Beirut during the period of high construction boom. At the time, it felt like we were living in a perpetual construction site. As you can see here, there were cranes everywhere, noise all the time. And I honestly really just wanted to understand what sustained this growth machine. So since 2017, as Beirut is sinking in an ever deeper set of crises, I have, along with a wonderful team of young researchers at the Beirut Urban Lab, chronicled various aspects of the city's transformations. This is in many ways a research of part living in a city, experiencing changes, feeling them, but then also connecting across our various individual positionalities. So some of us are neighborhood residents, some of us are refugees looking for homes in the city, members of specific religious sectarian groups, but also most of us are trained as city planners and trying to think what we were taught to do can help. And most of us act as activists trying to influence city transformations. So I know Layla, Ren, Abir, Isabella, I think are all watching, and Ali as well. So they're all here and they can answer questions. I set out a project at the time to build a database in an effort to counter what I thought was basically really a campaign of disinformation. And for me, this is really important because what we felt is that Beirut was actually being unmapped. It's not that we didn't have data about Beirut. It's that basically that data was being hidden. And by the data not being hidden, privatization was being possible. And many other excesses and exceptions were passing because we didn't even have a single map of Beirut. So we engaged in an effort to build this collective data set as a way to encourage participation between the Urban Lab and other researchers and activists in the city. And I can talk much more about that. But in the context of that, one of the things we wanted to do, and so here you can see how we went about getting a data set. And what we were trying to do is to find out who was building new buildings, where they were, what were they replacing, and who were the developers who were building them. And we literally surveyed using the technologies we have at hand. What we found, of course, is a common story that many of you are now familiar with from London, Paris, New York, but also Sao Paulo, Cape Town, Istanbul. It is associated with what scholars now refer to widely as the financialization of the built environment. That is when capital accrued through financial channels basically penetrates the built environment and heightens the independence of city making, the interdependence, of capital with city making. And so early on, scholars talked about transforming infrastructures, waterfronts, and now more recently, more and more about housing. So this is what Raquel Rolnik has called an unlocking of land values in cities, effectively reducing land into a single abstraction, really, that of a financial asset. On the surface, the developments we observed in Beirut fit well the definition. So we can really talk about the fact, particularly when one begins by not how is financialization happening, but what are the impacts of such financialization on cities. So when you look at what has transformed, we were indeed building bigger, larger apartments, and most interestingly, emptier apartments. And that is very much what scholars have called safety investment boxes, reflecting the nature of Lebanon's post-war economy, which is really one of speculative real estate. Yet scholars in the North have explained this by talking about the circulation of financial capital, specifically through specific actors and tools like banks, lenders, private equity funds, but also financial markets like stock exchanges, mortgage-backed securities. And I can go on with the list of ways in which people have explained financialization. What's very interesting is that in Beirut, none of these tools actually existed. And so we started thinking about what were the, from the bottom up or from the ground, to use Michele's words, we started looking for what were the plural processes that helped capital flow in buildings. What were the nodes, agents, institutions, actors that make it possible? And where were frictions and tensions? And I'm going through some of the work we've produced visually. I hope I'm not being distracting, but you can see like the effort to map every single developer, who they know, where they are, and then try to understand what this comes up to. Staying close to the ground, however, led us also to unexpected findings. I'm not going to talk today about what we find looking at who built Beirut's fancy city. I want to extend that research to talk today about the connections between these luxurious developments and the more dilapidated realities, such as the one you see here. Because rather than mere displacement and replacement, I want to argue that the last decade of heavy investments in land has generated a large reorganization of the entire social fabric of the city, and not only new development, one in which the social structures of the neighborhoods are being rearranged through transfers of wealth at multiple levels. And to do that, we've anchored the research around that notion of property, understood, of course, as the core of a set of relational transformations that are occurring to us. So for us, that are occurring in Beirut. So for us, property has been a pivotal concept to understand the relational mechanisms set in place to transform conditions of urban inhabitants in the last decade. Through the exchange of property, but also its partial transfer, its use as collateral, the power it grants to the financially literate, those who actually can be real estate accumulators, to negotiate, and they can therefore negotiate the maintenance and accumulation of wealth with those who don't. So property owners themselves are being rearranged along a trajectory where some individuals and families are being repositioned depending on whether they are investment literate, so they're able to accumulate property, or conversely, if their wealth is dissipating, and with it, often their inherited security. Property also grants privileges to those who can play the role of landlord and those who cannot. They can act as gatekeepers in neighborhoods, decide on the conditions and modalities in which inhabitants can occur, and their power grows enormously when the transactions are informal. Or when any semblance of a state or justice is basically absent, and therefore the law can come in, but it doesn't come in as protection, it just comes in to be used or played among actors. For example, when refugees, as is what is happening now, are described as illegal, and therefore the law comes in to transform even the access or the negotiation around access to housing through discriminatory practices. Property also individuates relation when access to housing occurs through market channels. So there's no collective process. Individuals struggle for housing. It's basically landlord and tenant. It's no longer, it's two individuals, and there's no conception of a shared collective. And of course, that normalizes unequal relations, and it allows to rename people and reposition them. And again, here, I'm talking a lot about refugees right now because there's a campaign against them in Beirut, so that's the main example that comes to mind. But refugees become tenants, and they channel aid money to pay rent, but they're no longer refugees. Their only status or right to housing is through tenancy. Of course, finally, property is also a moral order. And it's hard to explain all of that in a presentation. And of course, I'm using the work of numerous scholars, including those that have been thinking about my methods of enrichment in the last decade, like Boltanski and Eker, but also all those who have done fabulous work on property, like Blomley, Bromley, Gear Smith, Allen, and McDowell, and I can name a lot. So that's just bringing all these things together. I'm trying to extend the argument that property is a relation of technology that goes a long way to explain how neighborhood access happens, how the distribution of housing options actually occurs, how inequalities, displacement, segregation is exacerbated. And in the specific case that I'm presenting today, it allows us to locate buildings such as Wizart al-Iqtisad in relation to the city's fabric and explore this building as one location where multiple processes land and intersect to support spatial and social rearrangements, but also to generate the kind of precarious inhabitants that is afforded in a city ravaged by financialization. And I'm only talking about property and actors. I don't mean to silence the inhabitants, but I'm trying to recognize that a manufactured vulnerability or precarity, to use Nisar Sarhi's word, sustains this form of precarious inhabitants. And so to research that, we've been in the lab looking at buildings such as Wizart al-Iqtisad, although the specific case of this building doesn't actually intersect. But the way we've come to actually research them and the intersection with the financialization literature is, and I think I skipped this slide, or I lost it. No, there's a missing set of slides, sorry. I'm just gonna exit and go back, sorry. Yeah, it's not showing, so I'll just show it through this way. I think it's not projecting in the full screen. In any case, sorry, we came across a building like Wizart al-Iqtisad because when we surveyed new developments in Beirut on the basis of a list of buildings we obtained for places where building permits had been filed, we found 138 buildings where multi-story residential complexes were standing. These buildings were often inhabited by impoverished Lebanese families benefiting from a rental protection, along with Syrian refugees and migrant workers. So basically, people lived in buildings and they weren't aware that a demolition plan was actually underway and that even a building permit had been filed and was in the process of being approved. There were also within the same fabric other buildings that seemed stuck, investments of earlier booms. So we started expanding the research and asking ourselves, what is happening here? We went beyond these building permits to document as much as we could cases such as these ones that we built a database of that's available for people to check, where we retold stories of buildings, where we knew what we called precarious homes, where we knew that basically the building was slated for demolition or it was being held in this form, while people lived there in very high levels of uncertainty, unsure when they will be evicted. We came also to the problem from another direction, which is from a neighborhood study. But back to the building, basically the fact that financialization was seeping into the fabric of Beirut so seamlessly that one could live in a building not knowing that it had been slated for demolition, and no one inquires, asks, or informs, gears our team's attention to the multiple invisible disruptions that are yet to come. Consequently, we expanded the research more systematically, looking on the one hand at what we described as cases of precarity, and on the other hand, on neighborhoods. And what we basically point to is some kind of an anticipatory capital that we should add in our reading of the financialization of cities to stop thinking only about the new developments, but think also of developments such as these as places where a lot of capital is actually flowing, because transactions are happening on these buildings, but capital is flowing to buy and sell them as assets, and they are conversely presented this way because we think that they lack capital. So when we think of it this way, we realize that there's a big stock of housing that's held by developers, but also by homeowners who have bought in this idea of an expectation of profit. And these buildings basically fall within this idea that there's an anticipation of a future redevelopment that will make a lucrative profit. And those property speculations eventually encourage developers to play what the late Mike Davis has called the infinite game of real estate capitalism, which is always optimistic. So there's a promise that the market will recover, that values will become higher. And as long as one is wedded to an understanding of the city as on an inevitable trajectory of modernization and redevelopment, older buildings are imagined as future redevelopments. And it looks optimistic, and it looks like there are cycles of growth that are happening again and again. But when the predictability of such transformations is less certain, and I think here we're hearing more and more scholars talking about the fact that there is no clear future for where we are going, then we let go of the promise of expectation of a coherent, logical trajectory and approach urban transformation with a more experimental attitudes. And here we look at these buildings that maybe stick or maybe that are stuck, and extend the timeline in which we study financialization beyond the boom to understand also how things work and how they are inhabited in moments of bust. And in doing that, one thing that we've realized studying multiple cases is that we moved away from the focus that financialization has put on property transactions and home ownership, and we begin to think much more about rent, and rent particularly in the South. So that, is my screen sharing paused?
Your screen is sharing, yes, Mona. We are seeing the slide building developers, BBED.
Yeah, that's wrong. Completely. Sorry, I've been changing slides and you guys are not seeing them. Sorry. Let me go back to my PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, don't worry, it's okay. It's fine. It's what it is with these Zoom meetings, so.
I thought I was better at it. Sorry. Do you now see that building?
Yeah.
So let's go back to it then, and let me start from it again. So back to the building and to that focus on, and with the background of everything I have just described. I'm going to go back to the building and sort of use the frames that I have outlined to pull out some of the elements that you can see in this case study. In its original design, the building included two types of layouts. The first 5 floors were designed as either studios or one-bedroom apartments. The upper floors included larger units of 1 or 3 apartments. In the last decade, the layout has been modified to accommodate more tenants and increasing profits. Larger apartments were subdivided into several one-bedroom apartments to increase the number of housing units. Severe overcrowding is one of the main aspects we could observe. Several apartments accommodate 2 or more families to share the rent, a practice recorded in numerous other buildings nearby, where tenant families pool to plan ahead for possible unemployment. On average, 5 occupants share a room. Consequently, tenants tend to rearrange the rooms to serve as living spaces during the day and bedrooms at night. Additionally, many apartments have no proper kitchen or bathroom, and they instead use makeshift corners in shared rooms. Furnitures tend to be mishmash and ad hoc, combining donations with things found on the street. Almost all building tenants, when we visited, were actually Syrian refugees. All working tenants reported holding low-wage jobs, such as construction work or services. In addition, a large number of delivery motorcycles were parked in the building entrance, suggesting that a significant number of men residing in the building work as food delivery drivers, one of the main occupations of Syrian refugee workers in today's Beirut. Many tenants reported they had to work day and night shifts in order to afford the high cost of rent and to meet their family's basic needs. They also relied on aid money for survival. None of the tenants holds a formal rent contract. Instead, the building gatekeeper, Abu Firas, and the tenants agree verbally on rental terms. This leaves the tenants in a state of uncertainty regarding future possible rent increases. Interviews with 30 households conducted in the winter of 2023 showed that only 4 didn't experience a change in rent in the last 3 months, while 6 were asked to convert the rent already to dollars because the Lebanese pound was devaluating. and 20 reported they were negotiating incessantly rent increases. By summer 2023, almost all the apartments had shifted to paying in dollars. Furthermore, many residents recounted the horror of living under constant eviction threats when they were unable to pay the rent on time. The gatekeeper, Abu Firas, who is responsible for collecting the rent, acts as the enforcer, and he's the liaison between the wakil, or what we call the wakil in the local context. Abu Firas also organizes building utilities, so he collects monthly subscriptions from all the tenants to cover the cost of the electricity that goes to pump water from an illegally dug well behind the building. In some, if you think about it, it looks like a market and people are renting in a tenement, but in practice, what we're seeing is a set of relations that allow one individual who's not the owner, but a Syrian refugee himself, to orchestrate without huge benefits, really, access and rent. It allows refugees to inhabit the city, but only in temporary, uncertain ways as tenants, and it channels aid money to allow for the market to exist. So in many ways, aid money allows for the fiction of the market to continue. But who owns the building if it's not Abu Firas? So the building was developed in the 60s, at the time of Beirut's big boom. According to old rental records, it was first held by a Saudi princess who sold it in 1974 to three businessmen, a Jordanian national, an Emirati national, and a Lebanese lawyer. And it was very common during that period to have foreign investors build and then rent out units as a business. With the outbreak of the civil war in 1975, it became quickly better to sell. And by the early 80s, the Lebanese shareholder, who was the only one on the ground, began to sell shares in the building to individuals who wanted an apartment. Records show several court cases asking for official subdivision of the building as of the early 80s. And yet, this was very short-lived because by 1984, the building and the surrounding neighborhoods were occupied by families displaced from other sections of the city. So it was squatted for at least a decade. And this was facilitated by the local militia that controlled the district throughout the civil war. The civil war ends in 1991, and the municipal records show that the involvement, that at that point, a retired general of the Lebanese army comes in. He's known to hold connections, so we've been investigating, and he's known to hold connections with one of the local influential political parties in the city, close to the municipality. We are told through reading papers, interviewing neighborhood informants, that he was asked to support the foreign investors in evicting squatters during this period. Others further claimed that he also facilitated a little bit later the removal of stocks of weapons from the basement of the building. However, the terms of the service in which he would actually do this support seem to have been unclear, as the building has been taken by a spiral of property conflict and lawsuits as of 2001. And the municipal records show a flurry of often contradictory letters with opposing claims. These don't seem to matter really on the ground, where, although his name doesn't appear among the listed official holders of the property, the retired general is the de facto custodian. And he has delegated to the gatekeeper, Abu Firas, everything related to building management, including the allocation of tenants, the collection of rents, servicing, and the management of the underground parking that mostly services low-paid employees of the area. A Syrian national who has resided in Beirut since 2005, 6 years before the outbreak of the war. So he first came to Beirut as a migrant worker, but then eventually became a refugee. Abu Firas is known in the neighborhood, and he has conducted several jobs before taking over this building. And he only receives a salary and residency on the ground floor. And what you're seeing here is some of the permits and buildings we were able to find in the municipal records. And I always like to say, when I point to these issues to colleagues who work in Europe or in the US, that when we describe municipal records, don't imagine that it looks like a clean room with like folders and shelves. And it typically is, you wear a mask way before COVID because there's a lot of dust, and big boots because there may be rats and cockroaches, and you're looking into things that are not well classified, and you're not sure what you're going to find in the records. So it's often an adventure. Sometimes some municipalities have better records than others, but it's often an adventure to actually decide to do archival or any kind of record work. When Abu Firas took charge of the building in 2009, so this is again coming from interviews on the ground, Wizard al-Iqtisad was vacant. A deteriorated condition suggested that it would be inhabitable. Squatted for at least 10 years of civil war, the building had suffered over 40 years of no maintenance. Abu Firas was hired to manage the underground parking below the building and prevent any squatting in the building. However, it was the time when building construction was booming, so he saw an opportunity to make money. He's the one who suggested to the retired general, before the outbreak of the war, that they rent out units to Syrian male workers employed in the construction sites nearby. In 2010, 1 year before the beginning of the war in Syria, he began to rent the unit at cheap rates, while tenants rearranged the building's internal divisions to turn them into multiple-room apartments into single-room units. After all, they were construction workers, so they could pay lower rent to fix the building and turn it into what it is right now. When the war broke out in Syria, the client pool expanded with the arrival of refugees, and Abu Firas exclusively rents now to Syrian refugees. The retired general, I should say, also rents out the spaces behind the building to the neighborhood informal suppliers, who pays him a monthly fee in exchange of placing 3 large-scale generators by the building entrance to serve the area. The energy supplier, in turn, sells energy to the block, including to the tenants, who each gets about, usually in average, 2.5 amps per family, without mediation from the building keeper. Abu Firas manages and controls building access carefully, and he decides who rents, how. While some of the tenants are his relatives, most have arrived to the building through word of mouth. Abu Firas further claims that the retired general sets the rent rates and that he negotiates rental prices on behalf of the tenants. However, tenants recount forceful methods of eviction when neighbors fail to pay the rent. Okay, so this is for this building. And what I want to say is that in no way is this building actually exceptional in the neighborhood. So just around the larger block of what we're calling Hamra, which is really a smaller section of the area, we counted 9 buildings that we documented in depth that looked exactly the same way. We looked at the patterns of ownership. All of them rely on individuals like Abu Firas to manage the building, more or less. But these buildings are held 3 by a similar group of investors, 3 by Lebanese businessmen who actually purchased them in the last decade and used this strategy to displace people who have old rent control contracts, and by bringing in Syrian refugees and letting the building dilapidate further to evict families who have been there for a long time on rent control that they think are not paying enough rent. And then 3 are held by what we're calling impoverished families. And I'll come back to this in a second, but all these buildings, while they have these similar looks, also embody in many ways the outcome of forces that act on the cities that are much bigger and much larger than the neighborhood. And that's what's so interesting, because then we can see in these buildings that while people negotiate in their everyday access, rent, and you could really just write about that. At the same time, there are the bigger forces of the oil booms and the original flow of capital, the civil war and the displacement, the financial crisis that has pushed a lot of money in real estate because there are no more banks. And so anyone who had money, the rich people, not anyone, went to purchase property. But also larger patterns of geopolitical concern. For example, when in 2006, restrictions on capital flows on particular communities began to happen in the so-called war against terrorism, we find it translating into strategies of individuals buying entire buildings in Hamra because they can't place their money in any European bank, and the Lebanese banks are not safe. When Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf and Qatar begin a standoff in the early 2000s, we find a flow of capital of Qataris who are encouraged to invest in Lebanon, And then when the ban on travel for people from the Gulf comes from the countries to sort of, again, in a standoff with Iran, we see these people basically having a lot of property but never showing up in Lebanon. And all of these larger forces that are acting on the transaction basically play a massive role in, particularly in this building typology, where they land and sort of concentrate and transform everyday life in negotiations that are happening by individuals like Abu Firas and his tenants, who are quite unaware of like who holds the building and how, and does he really own it. But they're not the only owners, of course. So I mean, if we want to widen a little bit larger the analysis, what we can see is that many other buildings are actually held by families who had invested in the city back in the 1950s, thinking of this as a strategy to basically have long-term safety. So they've built a multi-story residential building that they rent out, that they used to rent out. And because they're not financially savvy, because they're being impoverished, because there are no social securities, these families are basically losing their wealth slowly, either selling to developers or having to sell pieces of these properties in order to basically because they have someone who's sick in the family, etc. But also very often like having themselves also this idea that they should be benefiting much more from the buildings they have. And so that they should be making much more profit than what they are. So it's not that they are immune to the fiction of real estate property, but they're unable to actually play the game. Okay, and I think I need to skip all of that and wrap up. So the fiction, so going back to, and so if we think of all these and going back to Abu Firas, the interviewer closed, Ali, basically who was interviewing him, closed the discussion by asking Abu Firas how he imagined the future of the building where he is. And Abu Firas answers that the building is really not worth any maintenance or repair. So that's the building where he lives, where he earns a living, but he thinks it's not worth any repair or maintenance. And he assures Ali that the building will be demolished once real estate booms, the real estate booms again in the city. Ultimately, Abu Firas doesn't own the building, nor does he claim to hold it. Still, he joins the old property owners of the neighborhood. Those who dream of the fiction of capital accumulation through real estate, even as this real estate dispossesses them. With the state quasi-absent, save for periods of crackdown on refugees, such as the one we're seeing now, what organizes access to housing is neither aid nor definitely housing policy. Rather, it is the negotiations that surround social rearrangements over access to property, using the law and the market as fictions to sustain power relations without the once imagined legal recourse that could have secured some kind of justice. In these processes, property law is not only, as pointed out by Blomley, setting the ceiling of the imaginary of what can be or what relations can be developed between landlords and tenants, but it's also infusing huge power on the becoming of an entire neighborhood, sometimes to investors who have died and whose children have never come to the city. So in conclusion, the development I described is rarely studied within the same time frame of real estate booms. By bringing it in conversation with recent building development, I hope to articulate a more complex understanding of the deployment of financial capital in the city, one that accounts for how events unfold in place over time and looks at implications for people who inhabit the financialized city, how inhabitants transforms during periods of bursts and financial city meltdown, and increasing typical reality for many cities. I have thus argued that precarious housing conditions are the outcome of a set of practices, actors, and relations refined and repurposed in the booms and busts of land markets, in contexts where the entire access to housing is organized through the dominant relational framework of law, of property law, in a context where frictions are nonetheless high, information scarce, and the formal market mechanisms or any other public intervention lacking. Beyond bringing another case study from yet one more city ravaged by financialization, the hope is for this research to help challenge the hegemony of finance on urban development by contributing to a better understanding of how global processes manifest at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you. I'm stopping the recording now. Okay.